Good morning. I know we're in a rigorous academic environment, but strong good mornings are okay. Let's try it again. Good morning. Oh, that's so much better. Welcome to day 2 of Test of Faith, a summit to defend democracy. And speaking of academic environments, I am very grateful for the strong support from the McCourt School of Public Policy in offering us these amazing new facilities. Yeah, deserves applause. And I want to personally thank my dean, Maria Kanchun, for her steady support in all of our work. I'm so glad to be here at McCourt and Georgetown. I passed under a banner on the way to class this week. The banner says, "Faith does justice." That's Jesuit. I didn't pass under banners like that at lots of other schools I've taught at. So I'm glad to be an honorary Jesuit, and people even tell me I look like a Jesuit. So I was remiss last night not to note that in addition to the drafting members we had on the panel, we all were at a press conference yesterday morning. But I want to say that we're joined by other members of the drafting committee that I would like to acknowledge. Last night you saw E.J. Dion, who will be here later today. Kristen Dumais, are you here, Kristen, yet? She was here last night. They're all coming back to Nicole Flores, but also David Hollenbach. There he is, David, great. Kathy Caveney, who had a family issue, but she's been powerful on this committee. Aristotle Papanicolo, raise your hand. Dr. Eddie Glaude and Dr. Yolanda Pierce were also members of the drafting committee, were not able to join us at the summit because of prior commitments. So please feel free to approach any members of the committee if you'd like more conversation about all of this. So this summit and the statement we released just yesterday are meant to help spark a conversation. And today we're here to continue that conversation. We had a great start last night, opening panel, lots of hands in the air. When we finished, we went to that great Capitol View room upstairs. I told you it was a great view, right? A lot of conversation kept going last night. So here we are, a wonderful program today with a keynote address at the end from the incredible Sherilyn Eiffel. I hope you all will be able to join us for the whole day. So there will be a 15-minute break following the conclusion of this session before we begin our second session. And lunch will be available, so we'll feed you too. And our second session, and that'll be served on the Capitol room for the lunch. Last night, we opened with a deep discussion, I thought, about the test of faith that confronts us in this moment. Today, we'll discuss the test of democracy. Dual tests here, faith and democracy. As our statement of Christian faith and democracy emphasizes, we say democracy stands embattled, facing new threats within our nation and new challenges around the globe. This session will explore those challenges more deeply, and we have a fascinating group to help us do that. Let me introduce them. Now, these bios are so long, it would take half the session to do them justice. So I'll be brief in the bios this morning. Samuel Perry is the Sam K. Viersen, is that how you say it? Presidential Professor of Sociology at the University of Oklahoma. His current research examines how contemporary technological and demographic transformations are shaping American religion and its relationship to politics and race relations. So, Elizabeth Neumann took a red eye to get here this morning. Told me she changed in the bathroom at the airport. So we're happy to have Elizabeth. She served on the White House Homeland Security Council in the George W. Bush administration and as the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism at the Department of Homeland Security during the Trump administration. She is currently Chief Strategy Officer for Moonshot. She'll tell you more about that. A tech-enabled company supporting governments and community partners to understand and prevent violence. Johnathan J. Smith served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice until April 2024. Prior to the Civil Rights Division, Johnathan served as the Governor's Deputy Secretary for Civil Rights and Workforce and the Interim Commissioner for the New York State Division of Human Rights in New York State, in the government there. Kessley Janvier is a senior at Georgetown University, majoring in history. She's a student organizer and inspiring lawyer. She serves as president of the Georgetown University NAACP and core organizer of Hoyas, advocating for slavery accountability. Let's give a warm welcome to our panel. So we have a great group. I expect a great conversation. This group is specially chosen for this event. Now, Sam, you are, in my view, one of the best historians and scholars on white Christian nationalism, which our statement declares to be a distorted version of Christianity. Can you tell us about what white Christian nationalism is and how it is really on the ballot in this election?
Sure. First, I want to stress that it's important that we have these conversations about what white Christian nationalism is, because as the term itself has grown in popularity, it's not something that we have to say is a thing anymore. People are actually owning that label. It's something that people really commonly throw around on social media or in the news. And there's a risk there of the word itself or the term itself losing meaning, and it comes to mean everything I don't like. It becomes the left's version of the word woke, right? Everything right of me is Christian nationalism. I don't like it, right? And that is, I think, unhelpful. We want to be careful about how we use those terms, and so we describe white Christian nationalism as an ideology, or Christian nationalism generally as an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a very particular kind of Christianity, and that's where the white part comes in. Because we find in our surveys and study after study, we find that, especially when white Americans affirm measures of Christian nationalism, when we ask them these questions about the kind of nation that they would prefer, a Christian nation, Christian heritage, Christian values, that these things ought to be given supremacy or primacy or institutionalized in our identity, we find that white Americans clearly mean people like us, and they mean something akin to Anglo-Protestantism. Really, that's the history of this, is this country was founded by Anglo-Protestants for Anglo-Protestants, that Anglo-Protestant culture and people made this nation successful and prosperous, and the more that we drift away from that culture and the supremacy of those groups, the more we decline into moral chaos. And so white Christian nationalism is absolutely on the ballot because I think you have a regime, a movement that is focused on restoring power to people like that, people who believe the nation rightfully belongs to white Christian conservative, primarily men. And I think it becomes even more problematic when we think about how we see that ideology correspond to the erosion of democratic norms or the approval of the erosion of democratic norms, that democracy is not really something that they prioritize. As a matter of fact, in a lot of ways, democracy is in the way. And right. So I think it is quite literally a movement that seeks to advocate for a white Christian nationalist future. Whether or not democracy is a part of that is completely optional.
So these are, as our statement tries to say, theological issues.
Yes.
And not just political ones, but they're deeply connected. And seeing that it's on the ballot about the future of religion in this country, as well as democracy, is, I think, very important. You look pretty awake for having flown all night, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth has written an extraordinary new book called The Kingdom of Rage. You are an expert on extremism. And one of the sources of extremism and potential for violence is this white Christian nationalism, which has infiltrated the evangelical culture that you and I both come from. Mm-hmm. So for you, there's I think, a deep tension and cause of concern. I learned a lot about security issues in your book. And now that we're facing more domestic terrorism issues than global, and you've worked on both in your career. So how do you explain the rise of political violence? We have some other experts in this crowd about that too. And what are some of the vulnerabilities that lead to extremism that can lead to political violence?
Yeah, so I'll actually pick up on what Sam was talking about. The movement of white Christian nationalism is about restoring power. When you have a people group who perceive that their success or survival is at risk, and they come to the conclusion that the only option is some form of hostile action, that is my definition of extremism. I actually borrow that from J.M. Berger, who's a academic that studies extremism. So it's when an in-group perceives a threat from their out-group to their success or survival, therefore hostile action is necessary. And hostile action is on a spectrum. The government primarily focuses on the criminal side of that because that's all they're allowed to. But from a societal perspective, the lower end of that hostile action spectrum are things like harassment, intimidation, threats, bullying, and we as a society can say that's not acceptable. And in particular, over the last 10 years, and COVID accelerated this, but it started before COVID, our societal norms have decayed. We've become more open to the idea that if something doesn't go my way and the clerk helping me at the store doesn't seem to have it together, I'm just going to yell at them. And that seems like a minor thing in the grand scheme. But the more that we create the permission structure that that's acceptable behavior, the easier it is for more people to take the next step. And when you're talking about a spectrum,
Right.
the concern is that when you have a lot of people operating on that lower end, the non-criminal space, it becomes easy for them to hear messages that might be sowed by a politician or an influencer, maybe their friend, like, we got to do something, right? And we got to do something. Maybe it's I'm just going to yell at somebody online. Well, then maybe that's not enough, and I need to do more for my cause. I'm going to go protest in a way where, yeah, you're exercising your First Amendment right, but I'm going to do it in a way that's not very civil. I'm going to be hostile. I'm going to intimidate. Maybe I'm going to come ready for a fight, right? And we saw a lot of that in 2020, both sides. And then that might not be enough, and it escalates from there. And it's always a small percentage that ever actually move into that criminal space. So it's not just because you have a cognitive belief that violence is justified for your cause does not mean you're actually going to go commit an act of violence. But when you have a large group of people in the country that embrace that, it becomes a huge security problem, right? And so right now we have polls that tell us 32% of Americans are open to violence as a solution to their political grievance or political agenda. I mean, that is in part a definition of terrorism. Now, if you ask the question differently, would you commit an act of terrorism to achieve your political aim? Probably more people would say no. But we still have too many people that are cognitively open. 32%, that's like 80-ish million people. Anybody know how many law enforcement officers we have in the country? 800,000. We can't possibly deal with 80 million potentially violent people, nor do you want them to, right? Like First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, like we like our privacy protections. I'm sitting next to the civil rights guy. I'm not suggesting that we want law enforcement to police this, which is why we are the solution to this problem. It's not a security, a thing that security can solve. It is a thing that we, civil society, have to say, this is not us. This is not how we do our deal with our grievances. This is not what democracy is about. We need to find alternatives to address our disagreements and our grievances.
Very helpful. We need a lawyer on the panel today. And I just learned from Johnathan, he's a lawyer with a father who's a pastor. So I'm going to connect him to my son who just started law school. So, and Kessley is an aspiring lawyer. So, Johnathan, we were both at the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Law of 1964 at the Department of Justice, where you used to work. And that kind of gathering normally would have a panel, and it did, about how far have we come and how much more do we have to go. That's often a interesting and vigorous panel, often generational differences there. But I felt a different mood, a different environment at the celebration at DOJ. There was almost an atmosphere of deep concern that these 60 years of history on civil rights and voting rights that you've worked so hard on with so many others could be erased by candidates running for office. And I got to talk to some of your DOJ leaders afterwards, and that clearly was the feeling in the air. Did you sense that? And how do you see what is, as a longtime advocate for voting rights and civil rights, how do you see what's at stake in this election?
Great. Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here and to join all of you. And I'm going to respond by actually going further than even 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, to 1870, because that's actually when the Justice Department was founded. And one thing our current Attorney General Merrick Garland likes to talk about when he talks about the history of the department is that the department was founded in 1870 for one of the primary purposes of protecting the free Black Americans who were being victimized and brutalized by the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacists who were trying to intimidate them from exercising their rights under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And it's, I think, really unfortunate that here we are 154 years later, and far too many people in this country, I think, continue to be fearful, either physically or from other forms of discrimination or bigotry because of who they are, what they look like, where they come from, who they love, what they believe. And so yes, I think that there's a real sense of trepidation because we see both, I think, a rise of hate, whether that's hate in the form of hate violence. If you look at the recent statistics from the FBI, we see that the levels of hate crimes in this country are at the highest level in a generation. And you don't need to see statistics to know that. You can look at what happened in a supermarket in Buffalo a couple of years ago, what happened in a synagogue in Pittsburgh a few years before that, what we've seen happening in the wake of the October 7th attacks, which we're about to celebrate that one-year anniversary, and the ways in which so many Jewish, Muslim, Palestinian, and Arab communities have been targeted, have been bullied, have been victimized. So we see a rise of hate violence. We also see a rise of what I often think about as kind of legitimized discrimination through the passage of laws, often at the state and local level, that that make it okay to discriminate. We see that in ways such as efforts to ban or limit, or in some cases criminalize gender-affirming care for transgender individuals. We see that in laws that seek to erase history by banning books, by banning discussions about diversity and about inclusion. We see that in ways also in the fact that not only do we have this rise of, I think, troubling laws and restrictions, but we also see an eroding of our civil rights infrastructure.
Right.
I think we see this really starkly in the voting rights context, where we've seen the Supreme Court and other courts over time erode and narrow interpretations of the Voting Rights Act. We see that so the same context in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where it's becoming more and more difficult, where courts are adopting interpretations that make it harder and harder to prove discrimination, that make it harder to actually make a claim through court. And I think all of this, whether it's hate violence, whether it's laws that discriminate, that ostracize, whether it's provisions in court decisions that seek to narrow civil rights protections, I think all of that serves the purpose of making people feel less included, less protected, less involved in our democracy. And when people feel less involved, less protected, going back to 1870 and the goals of the KKK, the goal was not just to kill all the black people, right? The goal was to get people so afraid that they wouldn't exercise their rights, that they wouldn't participate in our democracy, that they wouldn't vote, that they wouldn't use the freedoms that they were entitled to, because they knew that if they could get rid of those rights and those protections, that they had won the battle, right? That by getting people not to participate in our democracy, that's how you keep history or a version or a view of a world that is focused on one particular class of people or ideology. And I think there's a real concern in the climate that we're in right now that many of the actions taking place will lead to that same action and that same exclusionary result for communities all across the country.
Stoking fear to prevent participation. I see a lot of you taking notes, which is good, because we're going to have 30 minutes for questions at the end here. So get those questions ready. Kessley, there is really a generational difference in how we see and feel and experience democracy in this country. Came up last night in our conversation. You were here for that. I hear you and other student activists and organizers not just calling for saving democracy, but for transforming it. Say what that means for you.
Yeah, so I think the best way for me to explain this is to talk about how earlier this year I found myself the most apathetic politically that I've ever been, which for context can't possibly be that low because I was president of the NAACP, so it's only so apathetic I could have actually been. And apparently I'm a loyal CNN watcher, so again, the apathy was like at a minimum. I was going to vote, but I was going to vote in a way that was disgruntled. Somebody on the Times, in one of the Times podcasts, had explained essentially that a vote for Joe Biden that was from somebody who was disgruntled counted the same as a vote for Joe Biden as somebody who was enthusiastic. And I heard that and I was like, great, so now what? And I think how I felt was a little bit of a microcosm of how my peers are feeling. And I think earlier this year it was a lot more stark because we were pacing towards a Joe Biden, Donald Trump matchup again, which nobody wanted, apparently. And it seemed like, I'm gonna speak from the perspective of a Democrat, but it seemed like the leaders at the DNC just did not care. And were somehow going to force us out to vote by with this whole we have to save democracy line all over again like we did 4 years ago. And this will be my first presidential that I get to vote in. So how I felt in 2020, it's not that it didn't matter, I didn't have a vote. But I was like, this is what my first presidential is gonna look like. Mm-hmm. And I just remember thinking okay, we're saving democracy, but democracy is what's gotten us to this point. So I'm not saying we should abandon it. I'm saying that we ought to improve it. We ought to think about how we got here in the first place. And I think one of the things that's come up a lot this year among myself and my peers is the idea of voting third party. And voting third party is not a viable option this election, right? At all. All due disrespect to Jill Stein, but she's not even on the ballot in all 50 states. So there's no possible path to 270 for her. And looking at that, it's not to say that we shouldn't have third parties. It's not to say that we shouldn't have better options, just that that's something that we have to organize for, and you can't do that in a 4-year cycle. So what we've been thinking and talking about at the Georgetown NAACP and frankly, unfortunately, at my dinner parties, is what does political engagement look like for us in this time? What does it look like knowing that if we stay home, we're apparently voting for Trump according to pretty much every pundit, pollster, et cetera, even though I don't believe that's fully how that works, not saying I justify staying home, just. Yeah. And so I think the thing that we've come to a lot is, okay, we want better, we have to organize for better. And I think the only issue I foresee with that is that not everybody is president of their campus NAACP chapter. It was hard enough getting members last year. And I think that's partly because we don't have a firm understanding of our history. By the time I became politically conscious, Obama was in office. My parents like to joke that apparently I told people in my preschool class that if they didn't vote for Obama, I wouldn't be friends with them. So I tell you that to say that, like, I look at my brothers, for example, who are coming up in a world with Donald Trump, and then I look at my parents who are not old enough to remember the Civil Rights Act because it was not during their lifetime. But I look just one generation before that, and that's what you see. And I think I'm in a privileged position because I'm literally a history major. I like to read these things that will shape my mindset. Unfortunately, like, I really like playing the Times games, so I end up reading the articles too, you know? Like, these kind of things that, like, shape my perspective, but to act like my standard of political engagement is universal among my age group would be ridiculous and unfair, and certainly privileges people that are like me that are at universities who, you know, have internships for fun, essentially, and have the time to be engaged, and that's just not the reality for my entire generation. And I think the point I'm trying to make is that we can't expect people to organize, A, when they don't know how to, and B, when they're time poor.
Right. This is a critical perspective that we older people need to hear. Kessley often humbly reminds that she's not speaking for her whole generation. What I hear from students at Georgetown and all over the place is how we need to rethink democracy, rethink it itself. So we'll come back to that. Now, Elizabeth, your book describes how you call what you call a corrupted faith. A corrupted faith leads to the pursuit of power and can then lead to extremism and violence. Sam, your book describes how bad religion can lead to bad politics. So I'd like to hear a little discussion between you two, a security expert and a historian, on that question.
No, I mean, I think that, like, theology obviously, like, plays a massive role in this, and it's a combination of a variety of things. Like, we live in a very polarized, partisan context in which our social identities have been sorted at, like, no other time in recent memory, and so to be a Christian is increasingly to identify as Republican conservative and to have all these other identifiers that go along with that. And as those identities coalesce, as the Venn diagram of all of those things become a circle, they intensify, and it becomes kind of an in-group, out-group thing. And with that comes the potential for, like, threat, perception of you attack one of those identities, you attack all of those identities, and I dislike everybody who is not a part of those identities. And so, but that can be amplified by various other things. So I'd recommend a couple of books to you. So Matthew Taylor's book, his great new book, The Violent Take It by Force. A political scientist named Paul Jupe and his co-authors are coming out with a new book looking at Christian nationalism, also with Christian nationalism and political violence as it corresponds with, say, Pentecostal apocalyptic theological belief. And Matthew Taylor's book also describes this as well, that oftentimes when you have Christian nationalist ideology, which is essentially like kind of a white aggrievement theology, saying that the nation has been taken from people like us, whom it rightfully belongs to, when you combine that with the apocalyptic idea that there is this cosmic battle between good and evil, it provides the permission structure, not even the permission structure, really the command or the motivation to say all options are on the table, right? Like we've got to be willing to do what is necessary, and this is a battle not between Democrats and Republicans. This is God and Satan, right? This is angels and demons. This is plunging America into 1,000 years of darkness if we do not win this election. That is the kind of rhetoric that you hear on like Reawaken America tours and those kinds of things. And so it is political. It is also highly theological that adjusts the dial on the intensity of this kind of rhetoric.
So you're being humble. Name a couple of your books on this too.
I would say a recent book, The Flag and the Cross. So we talk about how really this overlap between America as a Christian nation and America as a white nation is very much within the white Christian consciousness in the United States. Historically quite blurred, and is still quite blurred. And the effect of that means that when white Americans typically hear rhetoric around Christian nation or threats to Christians, they hear threats to white Americans. As a matter of fact, I'll give you an example of that. So we published with a team of social psychologists, we published a recent study in Psychological Science, which is this great psychology journal. We're really proud of this publication, but it's based on a series of experiments that we did where we told a group of white Christians, we exposed them to certain treatments, and we let them read articles about whether or not, we gave them articles and told them, randomly assigned them to hear that Christians were under attack. Christians were being persecuted. Christians were experiencing bias. And it made those Americans not just think that Christians were being persecuted, but white people were being persecuted, right? It actually primed this kind of sense of racial threat because the identities overlap in their mind. And we went a step further. We gave them an example of a politician who said, I'm going to stand against white Christian, or not white Christian, I'm going to stand against Christian discrimination. As you've heard recently, Donald Trump, within the last week or two, said he's going to start a committee against anti-Christian like persecution or persecution against Christians. Well, we found that when we exposed this group of white Christians to this example of a politician saying, I'm going to stick up for Christians, they also heard that politician is going to stick up for white people like us. And so what we talk about in our book, The Flag and the Cross, is really how threats to this language of Christian nationalism is implicitly read as threats to white people, and they respond with anti-immigration, Islamophobia, anti-Black Lives Matter, anti-CRT and wokeness and all of those kinds of things. That's all implicitly baked into the Christian language. It's never, as Kristen Dumais was talking about last night, it's never about just religion. It's always baked into this package of politics and race and kind of rhetoric. And so that's important to recognize when we talk about the narrative about violence. It's not just religious violence, it's racial, it's class, it's political.
So having read all those books you wrote and co-wrote and all the ones you named, then I pick up Kingdom of Rage. And I hear from a counterterrorism expert how all of this is affecting security and the rise of political violence. Putting those two together was very stunning for me.
Yeah, there was a study that More in Common put out this month on faith in America, and I received a briefing on it yesterday, and the stat that jumps out is they asked people if they perceived that their religion was under threat. And some of the numbers are high for groups that I would expect. My day job, my company, looks at threats online, domestic violent extremist groups that are having conversations and who they want to target. So in the last year, it's largely been there's been a lot of anti-immigrant hate, anti-Black, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim. So So when you look at people who identify as at least I'll just take the religions, the Muslim faith, the Jewish faith, they're at the 50% mark. They feel that they're under attack. And you know what? That's justified based on the data, on the hate crimes data too. Christians are the highest,
Wow.
63%. And I got to tell you, since we monitor online spaces, now I don't have the latest hate crimes data. I'm not saying that there isn't ever a hate crime or threats or intimidation to Christians. I'm sure there are examples, but it does not even break into our charts if you compare the volume of threats to other groups compared to the volume of threats to Christianity. So something's going on. 63% of Christians in this survey think that their faith is under attack.
Yeah.
You're not based in reality, right? I think we can say that. But to fix that, you can't. This is where some of our learnings from extremism and for how you counter ideologies that are based in conspiracy theories, you can't actually attack it from fact. Because if you go at them with fact, this is their identity now, and you're attacking their identity. So what you have to look for is what's the underlying grievance? What's the underlying psychosocial need that's going unmet? There's fear there, and they've been participating in an echo chamber. This is my community. I participated in the echo chamber for a long time that just tells you to be scared. And why do they do it? Because it works. They get money and votes from it. Right. It is totally a manipulative scheme that is designed to take advantage of them. So I say that way. I'm not trying to remove their accountability. They're adults. They're adults, that many of them who purport to be Christians. They should be held accountable. But when we're engaging with somebody that's in that echo chamber, approach them with empathy. They've been deceived. And that's why they believe what they believe. They're scared.
That's right.
They're scared for no reason, because there really isn't a threat towards them, but they're scared. So find a way to be empathetic to the fact that they've been deceived and fear-mongered for so long, and now the result of that is a security problem.
Right.
There is a percentage, it's not a massive percentage, but there is a percentage that has bought into this idea that this is an existential threat, it is apocalyptic, it is good and evil, and God is on my side, and therefore, I need to do something. And I will tell you that when you study forms of extremism, the most lethal and dangerous is that which is fueled by religion. It has way more power to influence somebody to commit that act of violence. So it is very concerning. I don't want to overstate the problem. It's not like all 63% of Christians who are scared are going to go do something. But that is a really high number of very vulnerable people.
So bad theology becomes a security threat.
Yeah.
Right. Johnathan, a number of us are involved in something we like to call lawyers and collars. Adam Taylor's over there, Barbara Skinner was here last night, and we're training poll chaplains. She's still here. Thank you. Poll chaplains. The other night, I scrolled the screen, more than 300 people training as poll chaplains. We went to the Brennan Center and Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and asked, would you lawyers like some collars alongside, a different kind of presence, different kind of authority? And the answer was always yes. So we're training in de-escalation, nonviolent responses to threats of intimidation. Last night, one of our panelists said they're most afraid of armed men, armed white men showing up at polling places. So what do voting rights advocates like you, what are you expecting? What's DOJ expecting? What are you expecting at polling places and counting places this year, during or even after the election? On our poll chaplain training, we're now asking people to stay beyond Election Day through January 20th. when the new president's inaugurated. So what are you expecting, worried about, seeing happening around the country?
Well, yeah, well, I think a couple of things. I mean, I think we've seen increasingly the right to vote, which is, fundamental to our democracy, be under attack. And efforts made to make it harder to vote. And so we've seen a bunch of states pass laws to limit mail-in voting, to limit effort to vote at churches, other houses of worship. We've seen efforts to limit just the availability of polling places to make it harder for people to vote. And then we see on top of that just a real rise in attacks and violence and threats of violence, both to poll workers, to state officials who work with elections, whether those are secretaries of state or other similar officials, election monitors. And one of the things that the Justice Department does is it has the ability to go out and to send poll monitors and observers, but obviously there are far more polling places than there are monitors that the department can send out. And so I think that there is a real concern, both that there will be intimidation both before you even get to election day, or now that you have mail-in voting, like election season, that dissuades people from voting. We also see a tremendous amount of just disinformation about elections, whether that's disinformation about the location of polling places, what you need to actually cast the ballot and vote. I think particularly with the rise of AI, with the rise of social media, it's hard to counter all of the different streams of disinformation that we see out there, that we see coming. And I think it's really important, to your point about engaging clergy, to think about how to use trusted voices, trusted partners that people can go to, that they can say, I'm getting all this information, I'm getting all these threats, what do I do with that? One of the biggest concerns we see when it comes to hate violence kind of across the spectrum, irregardless of whether it's election related or not, is that there's just a fear of reporting. There's a fear of people actually going to law enforcement. Often, particularly when you're talking about communities of color, immigrant communities, LGBTQ communities that may have had histories of bad experiences and bad interactions with law enforcement. And so getting people who they trust, getting people who they can engage with, who can be an ambassador for them to help figure out the information that they're hearing, that they're receiving, I think is incredibly important in this moment. And, I think what we see as well is, and we saw this certainly in the 2020 election, efforts to just delegitimize the voting systems and our processes, and allegations about voter fraud, allegations about immigrants voting, allegations about non-citizens voting. All of this is, I think, designed to make people just distrust our system, to distrust our democracy, to not have faith and confidence in the results. So even if you do vote, even if you do get beyond all those hurdles, to then have that whole system be delegitimized is, I think, another threat that we're seeing.
That's a preview of our next session with Adam and Barbara and others. This is something practically people can do. They can get involved in this. So anecdotally, I remember in North Carolina, we had an armed white guy come into a black polling place and just stand there. Well, all the black voters are just stand there to intimidate. And if some activist or a Democratic monitor had confronted him, who knows what would have happened. But when a bishop in his robe and clergy in collars say, you probably are looking for the bathroom. We're going to show you how to find it. Usher them out. Or I got a call from our Detroit lead. I got to go. There's a truck outside a black elementary school polling place. It was a big Trump truck with Confederate flags and guns and flags. And And again, clergy surrounded the truck and said, I think you're in an illegal parking place. We're going to help you out. And so, we've also heard about voters who were, like you said, about clan violence was meant to scare people and prevent them from participating. So we've heard black voters saying, I hear there's going to be all this intimidation. I'm not sure I want to go. And when they heard there were clergy going to be there, including some of their own clergy, they went. They felt more secure if clergy were there for a calming presence and for information and willingness to confront all of this. So, preview of the next session. Kessley, we were on another panel a while back, and you were sharing the story about deciding in the last 2 weeks then to vote for Joe Biden because of Gaza and so many things. And you were making the point that I thought the older audience needed to hear, that people like us can't just say to young people, well, you should vote because the other guy's worse. That just doesn't work. And I was feeling from your powerful comments that night that you're saying if we don't understand, all of us, the critique of democracy that your generation's making, and don't make you trust that we accept that critique and want to make those changes and not go back to democracy as usual, then there's no real conversation here. So I think you may mention this one threat to democracy's voter apathy, the percentage of participation. So what is your sense of older folks getting that critique that you're making, and what is the mood of your generation now, and what are some possible ways to have a deeper conversation that's encouraging to them?
Yeah, so I can't speak on behalf of all of Gen Z, not in the least. But one of the things I will say is that the kind of idea that Gen Z is one of the more apathetic generations just plays into, we see this with every generation. They said it about millennials, how like the young people are lazy and, you know, we want to leave work at 5 o'clock and, you know, all we do all day is like go on Instagram and make TikToks and, you know, drink overpriced lattes with oat milk, right? And I think that the idea that we're apathetic voters fits really nicely into that characterization, except for that it's not true, and actually none of those things are related, and most of the people that I know who drink oat milk lattes are actually lactose intolerant, right? So there's a good reason for all of it. But the point I'm trying to make is that the thing I know from the people I engage with, like whether that's on campus or at my internship or on social media, is that people are not engaged, not apathetic. What they are is disappointed and frustrated. And it's somehow become this badge of honor to say, like, I don't like either of them, so I'm just gonna stay home. And while I don't agree with that, I understand logically how someone could get there. I understand how, if you're not fully aware of how our rights to vote were so, how the fight to get here was so fraught, and how people lived, died, and bled for it. That's what someone said last night. Like, if you're not aware of that history, you don't value it. And it's really interesting. I'm working on a rally coming up next weekend. We're aiming to register 1 million students to vote in a show of kind of Gen Z mobilization, the fact that we can be mobilized when we're motivated. And we were on an organizing call a couple months ago, and we've been working in coalition, so we have a lot of different people from a lot of different orgs, and someone kind of suggested that we make a point that we will withhold our votes. That was the word that she used. And the way that the overwhelming majority of this call was like, absolutely not, that's not the message we're trying to send in the least. We don't withhold votes, we ask to come to the table. And I think the fact that Gen Z has consistently been excluded from the table, except for a select few people. I look at how this past spring with the encampments, you had students who were like midway through finals, if not finals, then just the end of the semester, which I assume y'all know is a shit show, excuse my language. You know, you're tired, you're ready to go home, and they're sleeping in tents. And to me, that says I care about this issue, so much so that I'm willing to put my personal safety on the line to make a point. And to say that's not the same kind of fervor as the Freedom Riders would be insane, right? But instead what we saw was there was a clip of Joe Biden in the Oval Office, and I can't remember where the reporter was from, but she basically was like, oh, have the encampments changed your opinion on Gaza? And Joe Biden, like, without missing a beat, like, didn't even think about it. It was the most knee-jerk no. And so I'm watching that. My peers are watching that. My peers sleeping in the tents are watching that. And they're thinking, okay, but you expect me to vote for you in November when my show of willing to put my safety on the line is not enough for you to even think before you speak? Like, it's about coming to the table. Yeah. It's about saying, let's have a conversation. Let's talk about it. I think the other thing I hear a lot is, well, this is complicated. Okay, well, I'm not an idiot. Explain it to me. A lot of the time, I babysit quite a lot. The thing I have learned is that kids are really smart. You just need to explain things in an age-appropriate way. And to say that, like, we haven't lived enough life, or we have been pampered because we have social media and our oat milk lattes or whatever, is just to completely undermine our ability to reason, to make decisions, to think about other people, and to balance competing interests, and to kind of just exclude young voters, and especially Gen Z, who at some point are going to be the voting majority. Well, not some point, in the future will be the voting majority in this country, and have consistently showed up in huge numbers to just say that, like, oh, well, they're gonna vote for us anyway because democracy's on the line. Or they're gonna vote for us anyways because Trump is worse. Like, that's not the way to get people to turn out at all. And especially given the fact that, like you've said, we're making voting harder. Like, for college students, we have to order absentee ballots. That takes time. My younger brother came and said, can you help me register to vote? And I was like, absolutely. And then I realized it was much harder than it was when I did it 3 years ago. And so the time it now takes for me to help him is now, oh great, I need to go look up the ID requirements. Oh great, well, we haven't lived here for 10 years, so you don't have a driver's license. Okay, now we have to figure out how to get you an appropriate ID so he can express his right to vote. Like, it's insane. And given the time that we are taking out of our schedules, the time that we're taking out of away from study, right? The time that we're taking away from work to go out of our ways to order these absentee ballots, to make sure that you're aware of the deadlines, to make sure that you call your friend from Georgia and check, hey, I need you to go check your voter registration today because you might not be on there. So just check it real quick, right? These kind of like conversations for Joe Biden to say no was the most disrespectful thing to me as somebody who would have voted for him had I had the opportunity and been old enough, as somebody who has defended him on a lot of issues where I didn't agree with him. And I was like, well, you know, he's making the best decision he can, given the information he has, you know? For him to just say no was just a slap in the face. And it makes me think, okay, then, well, if you're gonna struggle for even to listen to me, then I'm not gonna make the effort to go and call my neighbor and tell her she needs to vote, or check on my roommate and make sure she's got her ballot. Because then what's the point? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You don't view me as an equal partner at the table. You don't view my vote as valuable until, 3 weeks before Election Day, and you guys wanna make TikToks to try and meet us where we're at, right? People don't vote on TikToks, apparently. According to, opposing Kamala HQ's belief, you know, and so this kind of like courting young voters like has to have started in January. It has to have started last year.
Right.
Has to have been a 4-year effort, not just a 4-year effort, an effort over the entirety of your political career. Because if you're going to hold public office, I need to feel that you are worthy of it the same way that my mom needs to feel that you're worthy of it.
Thank you, Kessley. So the future of democracy is who's at the table going forward. So I'm going to ask one question of all of you before we open this up to the audience. Was asked last night on the panel. I was struck by the answer, so I want to ask you all what I asked them last night. It is now 45 days. 45 days away from Election Day, and early voting has already started. What most keeps you up at night? What most keeps you up at night, and where do you find hope? What keeps you up at night? I'm getting kept up at night a lot. What keeps you up at night, and where do you find hope? Let's just go down the row.
So I'll recommend another book to you. This is by a political scientist named Eitan Hersh. It's called Politics is for Power. It's been a really transformative book for me the last couple of years. But one of the things that he diagnoses in this book is what he calls political hobbyism, and it is particularly characteristic of white, educated, middle class, primarily men. But it's basically like our summary of politics, and I understand completely like this. I talk to my students a lot about whether or not they're involved in politics, and most of them say no, and most of them indicate the reasons that Kessley was talking about. It is this idea that doing politics is doom scrolling on social media for 3 hours, maybe getting into a fight, retweeting something, reading a bunch of national news, and then saying I did politics for the day, and I'm so political, right? Because I'm into that, and that is not politics, right? But it's not only ineffective politics and just kind of something that we do as political hobbyism to pass the time, and we just, rather than like scream at the patriots, we just do that on social media. We just pick a different hobby. It is something that is also communicating to, I think, younger generations that that's what politics is, and so count me out. Right? When I ask my students, are you involved in politics, they say no. 90% of them do. They say they're kind of disengaged from that. And when I ask them why, they say, I don't know enough, I don't want to be an a-hole, I don't want to get in fights all the time, and what would I do? Right? Like what could I do to change anything about that? And they don't get, because they've seen what politics is, and it looks like what I just described, this hobbyism, and so they don't get that politics is not that. Politics is ground game. Politics is organizing. Politics is being active in people's lives and meeting people and trying to persuade and change people's minds. It's getting involved in relationships with people that you are trying to say, look, do you understand? I want to understand your spot. I want you to understand where I'm coming from. Let's try to come to a compromise so that we can try to build a better society together. So what keeps me up at night is white, liberal, educated political hobbyism that is comforting us with the false notion that I did politics for the day and I did my work for democracy, when in fact I really just kind of engaged in my little side hobby. So my charge to you is, I think, and this is where I see young people like Kessley, I think, knocking it out, is my hope is in young people. Because I think they are getting it. I think they are resisting that trend. I think they are fed up with that and they want action. And so I think to the extent that we can build relationships beyond our little siloed, kind of socially sorted networks, and we can actually meet, get involved with, and stay in the game. You can't one of our panelists last night, the good Reverend said, you can't disengage, right? Like, and to the extent that you feel safe, I'm not telling you to walk into a place where you feel like you're going to be physically attacked, but to the extent that you feel safe in spaces with people who disagree with you politically, I charge you to stay engaged in those spaces, as I am trying to do in Norman, Oklahoma, with a lot of people who disagree with me politically on just about every possible thing. But I want to stay in those conversations where we can come to a common understanding of values that we share, a future that we'd like to see, and we can overcome disagreements. And so, yeah.
There you go.
Thank you.
That's good. Violence. political violence. We are in the 10th year of increasing attacks, domestic terrorism attacks, non-ideological targeted violence attacks. We are the proverbial frog in the ever increasing boiling pot. We don't see it until you look at the data and you go, oh my gosh, we are so much more violent today than we were even 10 years ago. And because that's the environment we're operating in, you walk into a season like this, fraught with tension, we're likely to see something. And so that's what keeps me up at night. And lest, especially for this audience, one of the most alarming factors that the counterterrorism community is observing, and I was on moderated a panel last week right next to the 9/11 memorial with one of the panelists is an academic that studies far-left extremism. He does ethnographic research. That means he's embedded and spending time with anarchist violent extremists and people who define themselves as anti-fascist. They are scared about a second Trump term. And because they're scared, they are arming.
Well,
That is extremely rare for the far left. The far left focuses on infrastructure, protests, melee kind of fights. It's not premeditated. They usually are not trying to kill anybody. For them to be arming is not a good sign for our country. So one side wins, you have one group that's taking up arms, another side wins, you have another group that's taking up arms, and somewhere there's going to be a clash. I think we're in for a couple of difficult months.
Yeah.
My hope is that I don't think we're doomed to stay in this spiral. I do think there's a path out. I think we have a lot of data now that tells us how we break people on the pathway to violence. And it's investing in a public health approach to violence prevention, that law enforcement plays a role, but they are not the lead. And for 20 years since 9/11, we have spent trillions of dollars in intelligence and law enforcement and various security apparatuses, military. And I'm so thankful that we did that and we haven't had another 9/11. But it is insufficient to just do that. We have more terrorists today on this planet than we did on 9/11. And besides terrorists, we have people that are just willing to commit acts of violence for the sake of violence, not because they're ideologically motivated. But we can stop it. We're under-resourced, and we need to get started. It's going to take a long time to build the capabilities across our country. But if we start now, we could probably beat this in a generation.
Johnathan.
You know, I think often about where we were as a country 4 years ago in 2020 when we were coming out of the COVID, or we were still in the COVID pandemic. We were, kind of dealing with the aftermath of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And there were these national conversations around equity, around racism, around discrimination, and about how do we build a more inclusive democracy. And it wasn't so much that there were answers to those very difficult questions, but there were conversations, and we saw young people engage, whether that was through protests or through voting or through participation. And I think about where we are today, 4 years later, and it's hard to imagine that we were there 4 years ago, right? So much of that seems to have been lost, right? And some of that's lost through court decisions. It's lost through kind of battles that have been lost kind of in public opinion about diversity, about violence, about inclusion. But I think, what keeps me up at night is how do we get back to that place of meaningful engagement about how to build a more inclusive democracy, right? And that's not a Democrat, or it shouldn't be a Democrat or Republican thing. It should be a American thing. Like, for our country to be successful, for our country to be healthy and strong, we need everyone to participate. We need everyone to feel engaged. And I worry that, whether it's apathy or disappointment or disillusionment, that we've lost a lot of that. And I think that could show up in voting, but it can also show up in just how we participate in our democracy more broadly, and how we think about how to make sure that all folks feel involved and included. And in terms of what gives me hope, well, I think people like Kessley give me hope that there are people who are thinking about how to fight back, how to engage, how to build momentum, how to get people registered to vote, how to tell a story that's greater than just we're apathetic, but that we actually want to think about how to come up with solutions for the problems that we're facing and how to make sure that more people feel involved and engaged in our democracy.
Thank you. Kessley?
Okay, I'm going to talk for a minute, but I'm going to tell you there are two things that keep me up at night. Number one is the way that social media has encouraged us to make a joke of the situation. I look at how people were talking about the debate. I look at how people were talking about the RNC. I look how people were talking about a second assassination attempt, like all on Twitter, on TikTok, on Instagram, saying, we're very happy to make a joke. We're very happy to laugh. And don't get me wrong. I think there is a place for humor. I think if we didn't have humor, we'd be in a much darker situation. However, I really worry that by laughing at these things, by laughing at Trump specifically, we're going to laugh ourselves off a cliff and not realize how dangerous he really is. And so that's my first concern. And then I think the second thing that keeps me up at night is, I forgot the second thing. So we're just, the second thing that keeps me up at night is undecided voters. Every time I hear an undecided voter speak, I get more anxiety because I'm always like, oh my gosh, the point is in front of you and you're missing it. That's not to demonize undecided voters. That's a very valid place to be, but I think we might need to stop platforming them. And I actually remember my other point, which is that I'm worried about how we talk about journalism in this country. I'm worried about the fact that we live in different media ecosystems and we can't agree on what truth is, and that really scares me. And then I'd say the thing that gives me hope are my peers. I want to shout out my brother real quick. My brother is a freshman at Howard. He was queuing up to see the VP a few weeks ago, and he gives me hope. It's nice to know that I'm graduating, but he's behind me. And I look at my classmates, they give me hope. The people that were sleeping in the encampments, they give me a lot of hope. And more significantly, the people I organize with give me a lot of hope, because you'd be surprised. I made a joke on the last panel about how we used to have 11 p.m. NAACP meetings. And we didn't really do that very often because we find that 11 p.m. is a lot harder to agree with each other. But you'd be surprised how young people are organizing and how committed they are to spending their time that way when there are a million other things that we could be doing.
Thank you for both those, what keeps you up and signs of hope. We have 20 minutes, and we're going to stay on schedule because we got a next session coming up. So, Mary.
Thank you all. This is for Elizabeth. All of us in the faith and public life world in DC were caught flat-footed January 6th. We're working on that very carefully. The secretaries of state, for the most part, were caught flat-footed. They are working on that. Can you tell us about the improvements in the security sector as we walk into the next 45 days? Because that's an area that I don't hear much about, and I'd want some hope there.
Well, the Secretary of Homeland Security designated January 6th a national special security event, which unleashes a whole bunch of resources. The Secret Service is then in charge of the event, if you will, in cooperation with the Capitol Police. I will tell you that when January 6th happened, it was not an intelligence failure. The intelligence was there. It was a lack of action on the intelligence. Almost if there was, you often hear about 9/11, failure of imagination. It was a failure of imagining that the intelligence would actually come true, right? And so when those scenes started to unfold on TV, the first thing I noticed was, we're using bike racks? We're using bike racks, and they don't have any riot gear on. And oh my gosh, this is going to be tragic. There's going to be, I'm actually kind of surprised we didn't lose more life. So it was a massive security failure on January 6th. I don't think you'll see anything like that again at the Capitol. It will be well protected. Where I am concerned about this coming post-election season is the state capitals, because you have state legislators who have roles to play in certifying their elections and passing the electors on. You do have past precedent of militia showing up in fatigues, and there are some places where they can just walk into the Capitol fully armed. So I do think there'll be intimidation efforts. I think we're already seeing the groundwork that's been laid. A lot of it's through legal channels, and I think we should welcome the legal channels to do their legal work. But the conspiracy theories are already starting. So there's a lot of reasons why I am concerned. But I do think from a physical protection perspective, you will not see another January 6th at the U.S. Capitol, but I do have concerns about state capitals, because that's very much dependent on your governor. The National Guard's trained. You have a lot of election officials who've gotten extra training on de-escalation techniques. So I think the infrastructure is better prepared, but there's still that political dynamic. If a governor decides not to deploy their National Guard, if a governor decides, let the militia show up and protest in our state capitol, that you could end up with some bad situations.
How about a student? Student? Yes. Student? Yeah? I can't see. All right, there we go.
Well, no, we just thought you were asking if it wasn't.
Oh.
All right. Anybody? Way back there. Yeah.
Yes, my dad.
Hi, morning. A question directed at Reverend Wallis, but to the entire panel. When we talk about people having been misled, it occurred to me that a central tenet of a Christian's faith is this idea that you must suffer for your faith, that you will be discriminated against as a result of your faith, and that is part of the struggle. So I wondered, Reverend Wallis, when we talk about sort of reversing this, how much of this has to come from the pulpit itself, right? How much of how we talk about our faith, having grown up as a Christian, and the idea that how you get to heaven, how you suffer, or how you lead your life as a Christian, how much of that has to happen for this to truly be reversed?
Well, just very briefly, I want to turn to Sam on this. We need preachers in the next several weeks being willing to tell the truth and accept the suffering they get from that.
That's right.
Christians historically don't say, we're going to suffer politically, so we're going to take up arms. That's just bad preaching. So I want to see some preachers standing up and accepting, I might, lose my pension or my parsonage or my members, and Jesus says we should tell the truth. And the opposite of truth is captivity. Truth will make you free or captive. And we have captive congregations. captive congregations. So how do you not just tell people that they're wrong, but how do we free the captive? And if that comes back to us, that's what the suffering will be, not politics and what might happen to us.
Yeah, just briefly, that's such an excellent question. I think, speaking normatively as a Christian myself, like I think Christian nationalism is antithetical to the Christianity as I understand it. I have a seminary degree. I've worked as a minister, so like I feel like I do know Orthodox Christianity pretty well. I feel like white Christian nationalism is antithetical to that because it is a Christianity version that despises the cross. It hates the cross. In fact, the cross is for losers. You don't wear the cross; they wear the cross, right? Like it is a Christianity bent on victory, conquering politically, because Jesus already died, and we win now. We're the victors, right? Like we march in kind of a militant fashion. But it is going to take insiders, right? Like it absolutely will take people on the inside, like not the lefty sociologist coming to with my books and data, but it's going to be insiders who can say that this is false. This is not the Christianity that the Bible teaches, that we have learned through our traditions. I think in Daniel Immerwahr's great book, How to Build an Empire, or How to Hide an Empire, excuse me, he tells the story of kind of like the health campaign to like eradicate hookworm in the American South. So around the turn of the century, hookworm was this pandemic in the American South that like it sapped people's energy. I mean, people didn't know they had it, and so people were like, they got stereotypes of being lazy, but they really were just infected with hookworm. And so there was this public health kind of campaign to try to like get people to practice better hygiene and to take treatment so that they could eradicate hookworm in the American South. But they met all kinds of anger and hostility because people were like, you're calling us dirty, and you're calling us like, you're saying we need to come up and get your government whatever to like fix this. And they didn't have any success in getting Southerners to take treatment, to practice this kind of hygiene, to turn it to basically eradicate this until they got a bunch of pastors. And they made it into kind of like a big tent revival kind of thing where like you had religious leaders on the inside say, this is a problem, we know it is, these people are here to help us, and we're going to get together and we're going to solve this problem. And they had tremendous success with that kind of campaign. And so I think this is kind of a situation like that, where I think if it comes from the outside, many of these people will just say, that is nothing but lefty wokeism coming to slur us. But if it comes from people on the inside where there's a trust, I think there can be adjustments to the theology that are needed.
One of our drafters, Aristotle, had a question.
I also wanted to take a crack at that question. I think part of it also has to be these kind of interpersonal conversations.
Yeah.
One of the things I say all the time on campus is that I really don't want to hear about your racist Trump-supporting uncle, because you need to talk to him. White people and white Christians are the best positioned people to speak to their peers. There are enough white people in this room that I guarantee you all know a racist. This is the time to go have that conversation, because it will always be better coming from you than it will be from me.
I have two quick questions. One for Elizabeth. So you're saying that it's a matter.
One.
Okay, so it's a matter of identity. You're saying that it's a matter of identity, and they won't respond to fact, but will they respond to theology? And do we need more theology in public? Like, is the left kind of not doing enough theology in public? And not to put you on the spot, but do you think that this statement will have any effect? But really, do we need more theology, and should the left theologize more?
I'm always a big fan of theology in the public square, but the identity, because radicalization, it really is about finding unmet psychosocial needs, usually a need of belonging or significance, and I am oversimplifying, but those tend to be, when you look at people that commit terrorist attacks and join terrorist groups, and we look at what the drivers are in their life, it kind of gets summed up into significance and belonging. So arguing with somebody that's already radicalized about facts doesn't matter, because what's really brought them there in the first place is because they had an unmet need that they think this ideology is helping fix, right? Now it's not. It's a false gospel, if you will. And at some point they might become disillusioned. And there are two places where facts matter. One is at the very early stages when people are curious. When they're curious and they're exploring, you can introduce carefully facts, suggest that they might be being manipulated, suggest that that ideology, that conspiracy theory might have ulterior motives, not in their best interest. And that sometimes works. It moves people off that radicalization pathway. The other is when they're disillusioned, and then that disillusionment, usually something has happened. Maybe they lost a job because somebody discovered a neo-Nazi tattoo. Maybe they lost a court case, a custody battle with their kids. They're grappling with the consequences of their belief, not actually helping them. And they're open to the idea that maybe this belief is not meeting the needs that I thought it was. And so in that space, in a very loving way, you can come alongside and introduce facts. But if they're in the middle, it is you're just bouncing it's a rubber off of a wall. It's not going to sink in, and it actually statistically has a backlash effect. They dig in, they get more entrenched. So your statement is not going to move a fully radicalized, really into white Christian nationalism type of person. That's not the goal of a statement like that. The goal of a statement that was put out, that I signed on to, is to reach those who are concerned about what's happening in our country, to give them a sense of belonging, that they are not alone, to help them with the words to articulate their beliefs. But it's also a protective factor for those that might be on that vulnerable bubble. It's a way for somebody to say, to a friend, like, Sam, you're saying some interesting things. I just read this statement. I wonder if we could talk about it, right? And so you're always doing those types of conversations from a place of curiosity and love, not a place of trying to convince them that you're right.
It's conversations where they need to be had. I see third row over here. Yes. No, you. Right? Yeah. Right. Third row, yeah, please. Yes, you.
Good morning, everyone. I am a pastor, and I come from Decatur, Georgia. Thank you. I am a poll captain as well. But what I want to say, we're not afraid to speak up, and we are speaking up. But because I am in Georgia, and I want to, there are quite a few of us, and we are going to show up as poll captains on voting day. But because of the liberality of these gun-toting laws, we do have an element of fear of what might happen that day. I just want to put that out in the atmosphere. I know you can't fix that, but I want to tell you that it is a reality. Because we need your prayers in Georgia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your bravery.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a lot of fear in this election. Is Ruth Brownstein here? We have experts in the audience. Where are you?
Ruthie's right
Please.
there.
You're an expert on all of this. Hearing this panel, what's your response or question?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Jim. So, I think part of what this panel really reveals is the multifaceted dimensions of all the threats that we are facing, from people who have been radicalized to apathy among people who don't know what to do about that. And so, I really think that I appreciate the breadth of this. One question that I would love to hear from this group is what role faith communities can play both in sort of some of these de-radicalization kind of projects, but also in thinking about how to build bridges between, more politically conservative Christians who might have viewed the sort of more progressive groups as like the other side or the enemy, right? Like, is there space for that in a moment where people are coming face to face with some of these threats? Or is this something that, conservative white Protestant communities are going to have to deal with internally before they're able to start building some of those bridges?
Anybody?
I think there are people that are working on it. I have spoken to at least 5 different small groups of pastors and Christian leaders from the conservative side of the faith. but it's slow work. I mean, you're talking about hearts and minds. I mean, they didn't just show up in 2020 or January 6, 2021. I mean, that's 3 decades worth of indoctrination. It's going to take a long time for that healing to spread out. But I am encouraged. There are people doing the work. You're correct, I think, that it's very difficult for a progressive group to come in and try to minister to a conservative group. I do see, though, a role for those in the moderate, middle, and progressive to provide emotional support, if you will, and spiritual support to those that are doing the work in their communities. So I do see there is a role. But it's probably not a progressive voice speaking to a conservative audience as much as it is a progressive voice speaking to that pastor or that Christian leader who's, how can I help you? What do you need? And because it's hard work and it gets discouraging. So that's maybe my recommendation.
So I'd say, I think one of the greatest gifts within the last couple of years is the people who have started owning the label Christian nationalist as, I think maybe initially kind of a basket of deplorables kind of move, right? Like they wanted to kind of embrace it, run with it, and say this is what we are and this is what we do. I think one of the greatest gifts is the people who have most kind of loudly and outspokenly embraced this identity and rhetoric are them they advocate deplorable things, right? They openly, publicly, everything from repealing the 19th Amendment to open anti-Semitism, to flat-out racism, to advocating kind of Nazi philosophers, to retweeting Nazi videos or those kinds of things. And this includes people who are writing books like a Stephen Wolfe or an Andrew Torba, all the way to political leaders who I feel like have completely embarrassed themselves publicly, like in Oklahoma, like a Dusty Devers or a Ryan Walters, who has made himself a national name for his Christian and nationalist advocacy. I think the fact that those guys have been so outspoken about their Christian nationalist views allows me to, I think, go to a lot of, I think, more moderate to even right-leaning evangelical pastors and leaders and say, is that what you're talking about when you think about Christian patriotism? Is that what you had? No, it's not what you had in mind. You have something completely different. Good, because I have something completely different as well. Let's talk about how we can present a different kind of Christian message in your space. And so I think juxtaposing what most of these people, I think about when they think of religion and politics and living out their values, kingdom values in the public square, they don't have in mind things that are Nazi adjacent or things that are literally forcing people to read Bibles in their science classrooms in the public school, and that kind of thing. And so I think the more that side, I think, is openly kind of radicalized, I think that allows us room to say, distance yourself from that, Pastor, right?
We're going to take a 15-minute break before starting our next session at 10:45. Would you help me in thanking our panelists? And there are some more hands up. If you want to ask a panelist, feel free to do that.